as one had the reading from the coming Sunday referring to what really matters and what matters less, in that context one can go into the question of our relationship specifically with the Spirit of our God. And one way of approaching it would be to analyze his operations and the way in which he's limited in getting through to us. So I'd like briefly to look at the gifts and to see in what way there is an obstacle to his developing them in our soul. The Lord did warn about spending our time doing well the material, which in fact will go into the material and disappear, and neglecting what will not disappear. So when we're handling the Spirit of our God, we're handling not the material at all, and one major obstacle that he will find is that we are orientated precisely towards what is not of that order. In other words, our existence will be completely orientated towards the immediate. Now, in that context, therefore, there's a lot of work on our part to readjust our vision, and therefore the channeling of our energy. This applies both to Christian in his daily life, but also to those engaged professionally in his work, for one can fall into that pitfall in doing the Lord's work as though it were something which depended on our activity, and all the time not letting him do it. I'll develop that in a second. The first gift would be that of wisdom, which is a participation in the eternal wisdom that made us, that invented us, that foresaw us. We have to do, therefore, with what we need to be guided by, and not ourselves to be working and expecting him to follow. So the first element would be that of abdication, of handing over, of ceasing to boss around, because we can boss around even our God by manipulating the things of God. A good example would be what might happen in a liturgical context, when we can actually use the sacred for something which is of a different order. That will be developed in another gift, that of piety. With regard to wisdom itself, if one goes to an Eastern church, one will see divine wisdom looking down on the assembly. They always have a dome over the assembly, and the Almighty, the Pantocrator, the Alpha and the Omega, looking down and blessing and also teaching it. So that's the correct optic of praise, worship and encounter. He's in charge, and it's his word that we need to listen to. So the correct optic in coming into his presence and his service essentially is to cease to be, in a sense. Stop making a noise, let me speak. And that's a whole work. It's not something that can be done easily, and our encounters, our liturgical encounters, can disfavour it if they become wordy. Whereas in the East, they're more inclined to disappear on the human level and be absorbed in something greater than themselves. They have plenty of time, 3 hours, and the personal does not enter into it. They just disappear in a cloud of praise and glory. So the Lord then, in that silence, what they would refer to as esichia, stillness, can get through. But we need to cultivate that in the West. One way is to cultivate our holy hour on a daily basis, if possible in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament, if not, somewhere. This very day is actually the feast of St Ignatius of Loyola, and they were the first order really to crack the structure. They postponed ordination to the last moment so as not to have the obligation of the divine office, and they never had the sung office or even the choral office. But what they did have, and what we can actually develop ourselves, is the obligation of the hour-long moment of mental prayer, and the working on the level of the will, they had and still have a very strict novitiate in which they work on the will, already with the preparation of 30 days before making that choice to enter novitiate at all. It's all to do with the invisible. So we need also that. They knew that if they had no structure, they had to have an invisible structure, which then would be sufficient to face any situation under obedience. It was rather like a torpedo which the commander could fire from the side of the submarine. They would go anywhere and explode. They were very efficacious because they did not exist on the level of the will. Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? And I believe with the depths of my will and intelligence that the command given is thy will. So they saw God in the command. That gave them great power. Wisdom then is a participation in the ancient Sophia that rules the cosmos. And by the way, St John of the Cross put it very succinctly but powerfully. God only uttered one word. It was his verbum, his word, the Logos. So we participate in that by listening, and we don't have to teach our God anything. Stillness then is the bedrock. Wisdom, and then intellect, intelligence, understanding. That can be cultivated or disfavored by our input. And in our day, we need to be aware of our choices. Many, even devout Christians, are not aware of the responsibility that they bear for the safeguarding of their soul, because they do not realize that by opening their soul to what might bombard them without screening from modern technology, notably internet and unfiltered television, is to, in causa, in the very cause, be responsible for a poor interior life. Already the quantity of words coming at us is going to damage us. We don't need all those words, and if we have them, we can't hear the word, who, as I pointed out, is simple. Stillness is the only means that we can provide to be ministered to by that word. And so intellect, understanding, demands that we choose well what is our intake, notably getting back to the ancient discipline of picking up a physical book and being able to sit still with that alone. People now at every age are damaged and cannot sit still. The great philosopher Blaise Pascal once put it in this form: Le malheur de l'homme, c'est qu'il ne sait pas s'asseoir et rien faire. The great tragedy of man is that he can't sit still and do nothing. We're fidgeting. So it's the same. If we can't anymore open up a book and be content with it, we're damaged. So we don't always have to have background noise, have a transistor in the background, or a television or a screen of any sort working. The sound of silence has its own beauty, and it favours absorption of just enough, the thirst for a word. In the purely monastic life, where there are no artificial noises, a word goes a long way. In perpetual silence, a word goes a very, very long way. How different it is when all day long we have background music and noise of little value. Counsel would flow from the quantity of wisdom that we have acquired. Often that wisdom is not inclined to be absolute. You know that in Latin one talks about out, A-U-T, A-U-T. And to go into that either or is often a sign of insufficient spiritual maturity and reflection. It's too simplistic. And by the way, there's a lot of truth in the ancient saying, a little learning is a very dangerous thing. We priests have a lot to do with people who have got into a situation of complete refusal of the whole side of the life of the church. That can be extreme left or extreme right, but often it's because they can't see the whole picture. When one has a lot to do with a lot of souls, a lot of the time, one sees how rich the variation is. A kaleidoscope of jewels, all different. And the correct attitude before them is humble, awaiting, and almost adoring, as one does before the Blessed Sacrament. To cancel out a certain proportion of the souls and their thinking is a spiritual childhood which never grew up. And if one talks to people, there's a lot of that out there. People who know a lot. And so, the balanced, mature soul is able to see in everything the element of good that might be there. Look at what Benedict XVI said in any discourse. He would pick out always the positive in any author or situation. Surprisingly, actually. When you see him, for instance, picking out the possible good in the thought of the likes of a Bultmann, interesting. He wasn't going to be completely pushing away. And one of his best friends to this day is actually a Lutheran bishop. He likes to talk with him. He always has. So it is that a lot of knowledge sees a lot of things which others miss. Counsel, then, is often not out, but et. And the via media, the middle road, often is able to take on the best of two extremes. Fortitude is something that doesn't apply only to the martyrs. They are given strength under extreme duress. They are also given inspiration. And on this day, one thinks of the very large number of generous, heroic Jesuit martyrs. For instance, in the Reformation in England, who under torture and rack were miraculously inspired to say the right thing. In school days, my spiritual father, a Dominican who had a brother, a Jesuit, Maurice Bevenot, an expert on St Cyprian, and a great ecumenical scholar, he pointed out to me that the Jesuit wisdom was something to be respected. He gave the example of St Edmund Campion, whose life he gave me to read, and it was powerful. He was put to the rack 3 times, and he thought on the 3rd time they really meant to end his days. His body was suspended in the air. So tight were they pulling that his limbs seemed to be coming apart. But he never broke down or revealed a single thing that they wanted to know. And of course he was hanged, drawn and quartered along with the rest of the huge army, the last of which has left his head not far from here, the great Oliver Plunkett, head of the Irish Church, as late as 1681. So, fortitude was given to them, but also it's given to us under duress. It's not necessarily the spectacular, as in their case, but it can be the daily not giving in. Humbly, perhaps, for the mother of a family. I have a lot to do with the travellers, and I see that the women hold it all together. Hidden, often sanctity, actually. Holding it all together against all odds. Trying their best. True sanctity does not necessarily have a lot of limelight. In fact, it's dangerous if if it is exposed to it. And if we need attention and applause, then we haven't yet started. So, fortitude is something that we need to cultivate on a daily basis by not, for instance, grumbling, by not, for instance, complaining, by not being disagreeable or showing that we're tired, by the little heroic act of receiving well somebody who actually at that point is a tiring moment for us. We would prefer to be alone, but the person will pick it up, even on the phone. This is long-term fortitude, never having moments of switched off. God the Father is never on holidays or switched off, and so a priest is never really on holidays or switched off. And he needs to be always aware that his word is the word of the whole church, and a bad word, a moment off guard, is a potential scandal for the whole church. Knowledge. This can be cultivated and sharpened. In fact, in women there is already a favourable terrain in the gift of intuition, which a mother has to have, because, for instance, for the first year and a half, 2 years, a child cannot speak, but the mother has to intuit what's wrong and what it's trying to say and communicate. It also is the case that a mother, or even actually a girlfriend, will be pretty intuitive after a while. You might say something like, "You think you can hide anything from me? You're an open book to me." But that's natural intuition which can be sharpened. And if we do, then we become actually participants in not only human knowledge and awareness, but something which can be actually bordering on the divine. If we ask specifically for the gift of knowledge, then it can be given if we do our part, which is essentially this, again, of not having a lot of output, but a lot of observation and inner stillness which picks up things. It can also happen out of the blue that we pick up things, because if we're truly engaged with the Holy Spirit, we will start to realize what He's up to and what His language is. It can happen both individually. For instance, if one is celebrating a sacrament, one is sort of aware that one is being nudged and pushed. If one is preaching, there is something working at us. One feels, yes, go in that direction, and we don't know why, but the Spirit does, and there's somebody out there in the assembly who needs that word, and we're being used without our knowing it for that person. Also, while confessing or giving advice, the word might come out of the blue. It wasn't exactly ours, it was given. But that can only happen if we're not all the time emitting, but waiting for. But it happens also on the level of good groups. I was exposed to the renewal in a big way in the 80s in France, where, by the way, it's not contaminated by anything which might be the case in English-speaking countries, because sometimes there's a slight influence of American spirituality and American Protestant Pentecostal spirituality, which is different from what one finds in France, or Italy for that matter. In France especially, it's very liturgical quite often, and it's very dignified, and they use things which, for them, are based often not just in our own heritage, but also something somewhat Oriental, Byzantine, even Hebrew, and they upgrade it by making it fully charismatic. And the Rosary celebrated together with all the gifts of the Spirit put in. It's quite interesting what goes on. And whole congregations have been born from that. But it's always of a certain beauty and elevation. It's not shoddy, not the happy-clappy, it's the divinely open, where God gets through. And there one has seen how the Spirit, once he finds that suitable, still and yet beautiful, harmonious terrain, gets through and moves. And we saw and still can see the gifts of the Spirit, notably that of knowledge, prophecy and healing coming through, all working together. Don la science, the gift of knowledge. And it happens in groups as well. It happened to us at university, you could see that happening, that people were given together a word, a knowledge of something wrong, of something in the group that wasn't right and had to be addressed. But the Lord got through and made the community aware of it. That only happens if there's a clear terrain. And precisely the Lord was doing that kind of thing to clear the terrain, get this bit out of it. A girl might have had an abortion and that kind of thing. And in France, where we had thousands of people praying together, it was extremely powerful. Big miracles were going on there. Big ones. All put on video, of course. And by the way, quite a few of the old monasteries in France and other countries by now are being taken over by the charismatic renewal, notably Le Chemin Neuf. Le Chemin Neuf has not suffered the disasters of some of the other groups that came out of the renewal. It's remained very solid and very strong, and it's good. It's been blessed by the Lord, and they have a lot of beautiful monasteries. Interesting. It's France. Not at all Americanized, and often with bishops behind them. Remember at Achs, it was always a bishop who would preside, a different bishop every morning. Piety. That is something which concerns us all. Filial piety is the relationship between a son and his parents, demands obedience and respect. With God, the same applies. And this is something that breaks through in our worship. Anything that pertains to God must be handled with that notion of serving the Divine Majesty and not bring that Divine Majesty to do what we want. And therefore we go in tiptoe to something greater than ourselves. So silence is the language of true praise. An atmosphere that we create, and order and harmony is its expression. St. Paul wants there to be order. God is a God of concord, not discord, he insists, and therefore a certain noble dignity and flow, a dovetailing, should be the natural ambit. If there's a jerkiness and a drawing attention to mistakes and all that goes with it, if there's too much of the human coming in, e.g. applause, not for God but for man, then he's not free to bless fully as he wants to. We have to do our part, and we need also to look at the centuries and also at the universal to be aware of that. It's good to be exposed not just to our own Irish thing. It's good to travel to see how it's done in Greece, in the Slavonic bloc, and also in ancient parts of Christianity lost now to Islam, Turkey. In other words, there one sees the unbroken, the unchanging, and one finds certain constants coming through. And one is precisely the unhurriedness of ancient praise. We are used to the McDonald's in this country, and it's damaged also our worship. Our God habits eternity, and we need to get into eternal mode, not to clockwise mode if we approach him. And this notion of speeding it up, speeding it up, speeding it up, has damaged our spirituality hugely. A priest quite often now will feel uncomfortable if he goes on for more than 5 minutes while preaching. In other words, the minimum has become the norm, and the people of God who really want to be there are not nourished. The others have command by body language. They look at their watch. As John Milton put it, way back, talking about an Anglican situation actually, the hungry sheep look up and are not fed. And lastly, the fear of the Lord. This is something that often is classed as of yesterday, but correctly understood, it's actually perfectly evangelical. We find it already in the earliest disclosure of God. We find it in the various theophanies of the Old Testament. There's always an element of otherness there. The burning bush, Mount Sinai, Horeb, it's all something other. And Moses is invited to take off what he's wearing, his sandals. This is holy ground, and he's made to be aware. that he's before a real presence. Well, we have far more than the burning bush, and therefore that same attitude of soul is what is required. Not to have the fear of the Lord is to talk loudly in that presence, to discard the burning bush and to make man the centre of attention. But every time we come into real presence, the house of God consecrated, there are angels around. There's already an angel given to each consecrated church from that point on, guarding it. But there's a plethora of angels wherever the Blessed Sacrament is. Also our own angels are there. We can't see them normally, but they're there. And they are wounded by our voices. Indeed, we know that Jacinta, shortly before she died, at that point exiled from her family and friends in Lisbon, in hospital, she was given this message by our Blessed Lady, that she did not want, our Blessed Lady did not want people talking in chapel. It was initially with regard to the chapel where she was, but it was a wider one, and when no effect was given by this word, she wrote to the bishop, which happened to be the cardinal at Lisbon, and gave the message there. It was a message loud and clear just before she died from our Blessed Lady that heaven did not want talking in church. Now, we know also that that has come through several times in the mystical sphere. Whatever one says about the sequence of events at Garabandal, the question of the centrality of the Blessed Sacrament is quite clear. Whenever they were in trance, they always had to face the Blessed Sacrament and would never walk backwards before the Blessed Sacrament. I mean, never turn their back to the Blessed Sacrament. And also, this was quite clear that there was going to be a time, they were given to understand, when this was going to be lost. In other words, that the honour and glory given to God in the Blessed Sacrament was going to be whittled away. We have seen it. That was the very time when things were starting to change. So if we're in love with God, we have to feel his pain. And I conclude with this. The fear of God is more needed than ever before, because the presumption that we have in going in any situation, and as often as we possibly want, to the Blessed Sacrament, without the necessary preparation, is meaning that we have actually lost the awareness. It is not necessarily the maximum that is the best in this situation, but the optimum. And therefore we need to be aware that a communion done with preparation, with the assurance of a state of complete grace and serenity inside, with thanksgiving, is likely, if well handled, to have over a time a beneficial effect over the soul, which a casual, very frequent reception of the same might not necessarily have. There's a lot to be said for the old saying, familiarity breeds contempt. And by the way, it's damaging, unfortunately, for a priest's life if he has to celebrate very, very often, because it's actually meaning that he's forgetting, if he's not careful, the otherness of the moment. Add to that the casualness with which sometimes it's not helped with what goes on in the sacristy before and after. It's something which hugely is going to impact on the quality of the actual leading of the flock into prayer. One cannot crash from a noisy sacristy to Mount Tabor and back. One needs a dovetailing. So the fear of the Lord is a protection of the sacred and an awareness that we're handling something hugely, hugely great.